start. Is Professor Donald Grubbs here? Don Hadwiger? Here he is over here. You're wanted on the other side of the room. Well, as you learned this afternoon, you can't stop a bishop from speaking. We don't have the authority, at least in this country, to ask the bishop to tone down his remarks. And as you have learned this morning, it's awfully difficult to stop some old-timers from speaking. As you will learn this afternoon, it's equally difficult to stop academics and government bureaucrats from speaking. So we are getting underway a half an hour behind schedule. We'll try very hard, I'm not guaranteeing we'll do it, to keep within our time frame of an hour. Now, somebody undoubtedly has articulated the question that was in my mind this morning, namely, what the hell is a mainline session in agriculture doing on a program devoted to agricultural dissent? Because certainly this is a mainline session. The Department of Agriculture is well represented here. Indeed, I would argue that this is, following Professor Goodwin's remarks this morning, this is the deviant session. We are all deviants on this end of the table at this time. But in a sense, and this is why I think Marilyn scheduled this session, because literally most of what's going to follow on this program emanates in one way or another from what happened in from programs and policies developed during the 1930s in the Department of Agriculture. And in a sense, it's appropriate that this session is held at Iowa State University because this university played a tremendous role in what went on in agriculture in the 1930s. From the secretary, who was a graduate of this institution in the class of 1910, through undersecretaries, through section heads and bureau chiefs, and personnel throughout the department, graduates of this institution played a role. To be sure, some of their programs and policies fomented dissent, but as I think you'll hear this afternoon in the session following, some of the dissent centered around the way some of these programs worked out and not necessarily challenging the basic ideas behind the programs. And in another sense, the programs and policies of the New Deal represented dissent from the prevailing practices and programs that were developed during the previous decade. Because faced with a complete collapse of the agricultural as well as the rest of the economy, New Dealers had to cope in a very practical way with distress and dissent, which here in Iowa took a very ugly turn early in the 30s, and they had to come up with answers. They had to come up with programs, with policies that spoke directly to immediate needs, to immediate problems. That there was confusion, that there was chaos, that there were contradictions, it seems to me, are things that one should expect. But as I think our speakers will point out, that given some perspective, the New Dealers were asking some of the right questions and were trying to come to grips with some of the more acute problems facing American agriculture. We have three speakers, and we're going to try, at least this afternoon, rather than have them come up here to speak from the table, two of whom are past presidents of the Agricultural History Society, two of whom, Gladys Baker and Wayne Rasmussen, work in the what is it, Wayne? The history branch of the Department of Agriculture, and Wayne Rasmussen is the Executive Secretary of the Agricultural History Association. At the end of the table, Harry McDean from San Diego State University is a keen student of New Deal agricultural policies, particularly as they related to poverty programs. So we'll start this session with Gladys Baker, and I've tried to alert each of our speakers no more than 15 minutes because we want you all to have some input in this session too. Thank you.
Thank you. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke for farmers when he said in his inaugural address, "This nation asks for action, and action now." Farmers had become desperate with prices that had fallen faster and further than in any period in the history of American agriculture. Hog prices fell precipitously from $11.36 per head in 1931 to $6.14 in 1932 and $4.21 in 1936. This was the lowest price since the 90s. Farm prices fell more than 50%, while the prices of things farmers had to buy to live and maintain farm production had declined only 32%. Burdened too with inflexible mortgage payments, farmers saw farms for which they had spent their life savings sold to cover debts and taxes. The alarming number of farm foreclosures were followed by a large number of bank closures. In 1931, a total of 1,075 banks failed in towns of less than 5,000 population. After the March 1933 moratorium on all banks imposed by President Roosevelt, more than 4,000 were unable to obtain licenses to reopen their doors. Most of those too weak to get licenses were country banks. Driven to desperation, farmers in some areas declared a holiday, using force to prevent milk from being marketed and to prevent mortgage sales of their property. They said they got the idea of holiday from the bank holiday. Highways into market centers were blockaded. One of the slogans used by farmers who became a part of the farm holiday movement was, "Let's call a farmer's holiday, a holiday let's hold. We'll eat our wheat and ham and eggs and let them eat their gold." Another slogan used was Hoover, Hyde, Hell, and Hard Times, Republican 4-H Club. The farm holiday was most successful in delaying and blocking mortgage foreclosures. Sporadic violence flared in many areas of Iowa and in other Midwestern states. A judge was threatened with a noose around his neck. Martial law was declared in a number of areas. Farm holiday members demanded a national moratorium on farm foreclosures, inflation of the currency, legislation to assure farmers cost of production, and cheap credit. They threatened a nationwide strike by May 3 unless Congress acted. The selection of Henry A. Wallace as Secretary of Agriculture was greeted with skepticism. Milo Reno, leader of the National Farm Holiday Association, said that Wallace was as well qualified as other men who had seriously studied the situation, but he had likely absorbed some of the economic idiocy of Iowa State College of Agriculture. Reno doubted that Wallace would be any great improvement over the present, quote, jackass who occupies the position. That was Arthur M. Hyde. Secretary Wallace felt that the farm crisis called for immediate legislation, and on March 8th urged President Roosevelt to call for action at the special session of Congress, which had been specially called for on the banking crisis. The President agreed and directed Secretary Wallace to call a Farm Leaders Conference. Representatives of the American Farm Bureau Federation, the National Farmers Union, and the National Grange were among the 50 farm spokesmen arrived in Washington on March 10, 1933 for the Leaders' Conference. On March 22, a committee from the Group of 50 called on the President with a proposal that broad emergency powers be recommended to Congress. President Roosevelt directed the Department of Agriculture to prepare the text of such legislation. A draft was quickly completed and on March 16th sent by President Roosevelt to Congress. The President recommended quick action on the bill as an experiment on an untrod path. The act had cleared both houses of Congress by May 12th and was signed by the President on that day. It is indicative of the emergency situation of the variety of proposed solutions that the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act of 1933 and an act empowering the President to inflate the currency were added to the Agricultural Adjustment Act as Titles II and III, respectively. To accomplish the goal of restoring farm purchasing power of agricultural commodities to the pre-war 1909-14 level, the Secretary of Agriculture was authorized to secure voluntary reduction of the acreage in basic crops through agreements with producers and by using direct payments for participation in acreage control programs, to regulate marketing through voluntary agreements among processors and others, to license processors, Association of Producers, and others handling agricultural commodities, to eliminate unfair practices, to determine the necessity for and the rate of processing taxes, and to use the proceeds of taxes and appropriated funds for the cost of adjustment operations, for the expansion of markets, and for the removal of agricultural surpluses. Wheat, cotton, field corn, hogs, rice, tobacco, and milk and its products were designated as basic commodities in 1933. In 34, the list was expanded to include rye, flax, barley, grain, sorghum, cattle and peanuts, and sugar beets and sugar cane, and in 35, potatoes were added. The increasing pressure of the agricultural crisis and the fact the act was passed after the crop planting season had begun impelled the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to proceed with the greatest possible speed. Emphasis was placed on production control for the basic commodities, but government purchases and marketing agreements were also used to provide more immediate relief and to supplement production restrictions. Both organizations and programs had to be developed at breakneck speed in the department's race with the sun, and both had to be adapted quickly to meet changes in weather as well as in economic conditions. The situation confronting cotton farmers seemed to demand immediate and drastic action. The price of cotton had fallen from 29 cents a pound in 1923 to 6.5 cents in 1932. Increased cotton acreage and favorable weather threatened to drive prices even lower and to increase a carryover which had already reached 3 times normal size. A cotton plow-out campaign was announced June 19, 1933, with the objective of eliminating during the first year 10 million acres, or 1/4 of the growing crop. This objective was reached. However, more direct and drastic action on cotton was demanded and secured before the first crop under the acreage reduction program could be marketed. A sharp decline in cotton prices led to demands during September of 33 that the currency be inflated and the minimum price of cotton be fixed at 15 cents a pound. The administration responded with a non-recourse loan of 10 cents a pound on the 1933 crop of cotton. The loan rate was raised to 12 cents for 1934-35, but was dropped to 10 cents for 1935-36. Most of us think of the business of dropping loan rates and putting payments, substituting payments instead, as a recent development, but you see it started early in 33. The loans were made possible by the establishment on October 17, 1933 of the Commodity Credit Corporation by executive order. And this is another interesting point because most people believe that price support was really done by loans. The price supporting loans and that it was in the original Agricultural Adjustment Act. It was not. There had to be separate action taken and taken under other powers than those given by the Agricultural Adjustment Act when it started in '33. Prospects of a sharp decline in the winter wheat crop due to weather conditions saved wheat farmers from being asked to join cotton farmers in plowing up part of their growing crops. The dramatic proposal to pay farmers for plowing up a food crop had been discussed at a meeting of producers and spokesmen for the department, but it was rejected. Instead, contracting producers who agreed to limit wheat acreage for 34 and 35 crops received payment on the basis of their proportionate share of the national production domestically consumed. Production control programs for tobacco were distinguished from other commodities by the use of quantity as well as acreage control. We tend again to think of this as a new development which took place the last few years in tobacco. Tobacco production allotments representing the amount which could be produced for sale were assigned under the acreage adjustment contracts for all types except cigar tobacco. Another distinguishing feature of the programs for tobacco was the use of marketing agreements in 1933 to raise the price of several kinds of tobacco in anticipation of the price increasing effect of controlled production. Tobacco growers who had signed government contracts, like participators in the cotton program, wanted to ensure that non-cooperators could not profit from the higher prices on unrestricted production. They secured enactment of the Kerr-Smith Tobacco Control Act of June 28, which provided a mandatory tax on the sale of all tobacco harvested in the crop year 1934-35. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was committed to developing and operating voluntary programs with assistance of spokesmen for the producers of each commodity. Since no organization with adequate scope devoted exclusively to the corn hog industry was in existence at the time the act was passed, one of the first steps taken by Secretary Wallace was to encourage such an organization. Because of sharply reduced corn prospects due to unfavorable weather, corn producers were not asked to plow under corn. The Corn Hog Producers Committee recommended immediate removal from marketing channels of approximately 4 million pigs weighing less than 100 pounds and about 1 million sows about the farrow. Insofar as practicable, the pork products were to be distributed through relief channels. The emergency slaughter program, which the press called the killing of the little pigs, shocked the public and distressed many people. Some farm people felt that the drought of 1934 was a form of a divine punishment for the destruction of food. Commenting in 1934 on these first adjustment activities, Secretary Wallace wrote, "To have to destroy a growing crop is a shocking commentary on civilization. I could tolerate it only as cleaning up the wreckage of the old days of unbalanced production." By October 1933, Corn Belt farmers were demanding an emergency program for corn to raise the prices before the longer time corn hog adjustment program could become effective. Sentiment for price fixing was very strong in the corn area where the National Farm Holiday was still threatening a nationwide strike. The National Corn Hog Producers Committee of 25 had recommended negotiation of a marketing agreement to ensure parity for hogs. Farm pressure for price fixing brought about a demand for government pegging of prices at parity levels by 10 Midwestern governors meeting in Des Moines on October 31, 1933. Secretary Wallace and officials of the administration were opposed to price fixing, but were concerned with the problem of an immediate stimulus to farm purchasing power as a part of the overall recovery. A corn loan program was justified on the basis that it would give farmers in advance some of the benefits to be derived from the short corn crop of 33 and the substantial acreage reduction scheduled for 34. With approval of President Roosevelt, corn loan was announced on October 25, 33. The loan of 45 cents, substantially above the farm price of corn was characterized as the equivalent of a modified price-fixing plan. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was careful in all its operations to include farmers in planning and operating the programs. The Secretary used the authorization to establish state and local committees and association of producers at the beginning of the Corn Hog Adjustment Program. Secretary Wallace had strong convictions, am I running out of time? On the need to secure direct participation of farmers in the administration of the program, and steps were taken to increase farmer participation in all programs and areas. In addition to the conviction that the use of committees provided the most democratic method for administering the program, the Secretary believed that this type of administration would contribute to understanding the program. He felt farmers would be more enthusiastic and more conscientious if they selected their own leaders. Secretary Wallace was convinced that these county control associations would develop rural leadership capable of understanding national programs and using the centralizing power of the national government. Despite the speed with which the adjustment programs had to be formulated and carried out, the administration found time to include farmer representatives and spokesmen in all stages of the process. This process was called by Wallace economic self-government and economic democracy. It was also called the centralized administration of a national program. Modifications were to be made in the farmer committee system, but it was to become a part of succeeding farm programs concerned with farm prices and conservation. After 1938, the use of farmer committees in program administration was to become a mandatory legislative requirement. The Agricultural Adjustment Program, with its extensive system of farmer committees, was brought to an abrupt halt on January 6th by the Huzak-Mills decision of the Supreme Court, which invalidated the production control provisions of the Agricultural Adjustment Act of May 12, 1933. Farmers had enjoyed a striking increase in farm income during the period the program had been in effect. Farm income in 1935 had increased more than 50% over farm income during 1932. Rental and benefit payments contributed about 25% of the amount by which the average cash farm income in the period 1933-35 exceeded the average cash farm income in 1932. Irrespective of disagreement on contributions to the program, there's been general agreement on the need for government action to assist farmers during the unprecedented economic crisis. Modifications have been made in later programs of crop adjustment and in the committee system of administration, but the basic ideas of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which have survived periods of drought, of inflation, of war, of reconversion from war, of changes in political party leadership in both the Congress and the executive branch of the government. Department and congressional leaders reacted with protest and shock to the court decision and set about to repair the damage. The department worked out a plan to pay farmers for voluntarily shifting acreage from soil-depleting surplus crops into soil-conserving legumes and grasses. Congress adopted the Soil Conservation and Good Farm Management approach in the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. This act, approved on February 29, 1936, just 54 days after the invalidation of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. In this program, farmers were offered soil-conserving payments for shifting acreage and from soil depleting to soil conserving crops. Soil building payments were made for seeding soil building crops on crop land and for carrying out approved soil building practices. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, which Secretary Wallace called a new charter of economic freedom for farmers and economic protection against scarcity for consumers, was approved on February 16, 1938. It attempted to combine in one permanent program the best features of all of the earlier programs and to ensure that they would not be ruled outside the powers of Congress by the court. The new legislation not only retained the ballot features of the old, but added new features to meet drought emergencies, as well as price and income crises. To meet the constitutional test, marketing control was substituted for direct production control. An authority was based on the congressional power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Violent fluctuations in supplies, marketing, and the prices of farm commodities were to be minimized. Consumers were to be protected by the maintenance of adequate reserves. The act stated that the policy of Congress was to assist farmers in obtaining, as far as possible, parity prices and parity income. Congress retained conserving the soil as a major objective and reenacted the Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment Act with some modifications. Modifications of the reenacted Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment Act included provision for acreage allotments for corn, cotton, rice, tobacco, and wheat, specific directions with respect to the establishment and use of state and county committees, provisions to safeguard tenant share of payments, special provisions on the allocation of payments, a provision for increasing the size of payments on small farms, and a limitation of $10,000 on the size of conservation payments. The new features of the 38 Act were stressed by Secretary Wallace as the ever-normal granary plan of balanced abundance. These included loans for cooperating producers of corn, wheat, and cotton under certain supply and price conditions if marketing quotas had not been rejected, and loans at the option of the Secretary. Marketing quotas to be proclaimed for 5 commodities. When supplies on the farm and in marketing channels and storage reach a certain level, referendums to determine whether the marketing quota proclaimed by the Secretary should go into effect, and crop insurance for wheat. The non-recourse loans were to serve the dual purpose of placing a plank under farm prices when threatened by a slump, and of financing farmers and holding surplus supplies until they were needed. Secretary Wallace stressed encouragement of systematic storage as a basic part of his ever-normal granary plan. Others stressed the price-supporting effect of the loan and payment provisions of the Act. Secretary felt it important that the loan rate not be high enough to discourage marketing, particularly the marketing of export crops. The formula eventually adopted by Congress provided loans at rates from 52 to 75% of parity. Direct government payments were an important part of the income of producers of cotton, corn, wheat, tobacco, and rice during the periods 36 through 41. They reached their highest levels in 39 when they equaled the 35% of net cash income farmers received from the sale of crops and livestock. Participation in the programs of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration steadily increased. During 1941, around 6 million farmers cooperated, and approximately 81% of the cropland was covered. The large stocks of wheat, cotton, and corn, which had resulted from CCC loans, became a military reserve of crucial importance during World War II. Thank you very much.
Gladys Baker delineated the basic program of the New Deal. Wayne Rasmussen will pick up the story from there.
And answer any difficult questions. That's what happens to the last
Professor Lowick spoke of me as a bureaucrat, and I guess that's correct. Reminded me, though, of one of the last times I saw my mother before she died out in California 3 or 4 years ago. I had grown up with her, my father, of course, and my 2 brothers, on a cattle ranch in eastern Montana. My brothers and I had left the ranch in the late 30s. My mother had moved out to California where she died. Not long before she died, as I mentioned, I was visiting her, and she said, "Well, Wayne, I had a letter from back home in Lavina from Mrs. England. She wrote that Benel Tom had a big wheat crop up on the east bench. Harold Larson had a good enough wool clip that he bought a new Cadillac. And you heard that Ken Lewis had been elected one of the county commissioners of Golden Valley County. Now, if you had only stayed on the ranch with me, you would have been a respected man in the community instead of being a government clerk back there in Washington. Well, why did I leave? Why did I leave? Those dust storms of 30, in that area, 30, 34, 36. In 1934, I was teaching a one-room country school, Twin Views Public School, Belmont, Montana. And that dust would come rolling off of those wheat fields up on the bench there so strongly that we'd have to light that old coal oil lamp for the kids to try to study during the day. It was rough. Hugh Bennett used these same dust storms, though, when they reached Washington to get approval of the Soil Conservation Service in 1935, replacing the Soil Erosion Service, which had been set up 2 years earlier by President Roosevelt. Soil conservation was then used, as Gladys has told you, as a price support measure. But perhaps it was too successful. After a couple of years of conservation and price support, the crops were growing so much, we were getting so much more in the way of crops that we had to go to the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938. The Soil Conservation Service that Hugh Hammond Bennett set up first as the Soil Erosion Service and then as the Soil Conservation Service was one of the really great early programs of the New Deal. And it's just plain going downhill and going to pieces today. I was interested in some of the comments this morning, and I was just interested in the bishop's statements that we've got to look after our soil, and we aren't doing it. You farmers here in Iowa certainly aren't. In some areas I've seen, you're turning this good soil. Some of you are turning this. I'll take responsibility too, because our department programs are encouraging you to do it. You're turning some of this soil into blotting paper, killing all the little life there, and then pouring on nitrogen that the soil that the corn picks up, and so then you grow a good crop. Now, some of you are still looking after the soil, and we've got to have more of it. But then a lot of farmers are in an awfully difficult position. You're pressed with paying next year's bill, not conserving soil for 10 years from now. We need a strong, new, not entirely new, but a revitalized national soil conservation program, or we're going to go even further downhill on that. Some of the work of the early Soil Conservation Service and of the Forest Service was done by the Civilian Conservation Corps. In the office, we get lots of letters from people saying, I was in the Civilian Conservation Corps such and such a year. It was a great experience. Can you tell me something about it? Can you tell me who else was there with me? Going on in several ways like this. People are proud of having been in the CCC. And one of the reasons was that today we can still see what they did. This Civilian Conservation Corps had been established in 1933. Young men from poor families enrolled, with most of their salaries going to their families. We've had revivals after World War II of the CCC, and most of those revivals failed for some reasons that I guess I don't have time to go into now, but it's a question as to whether we do need to revive this again. There were other relief programs that affected farmers. We hear about the WPA. You know, all those people out there leaning on their shovels or out there raking leaves. Well, in Golden Valley County, Montana, the first gravel roads in that county were built with WPA labor. You look around Washington, D.C., and you still see some buildings and roads that were built with CCC and WPA labor. And then the NYA, the National Youth Administration. NYA helped get me through college, aside from teaching school at places like Twin Views Public School. I went up to the University of Montana at Missoula and got 25 cents an hour for correcting papers in history class. After I'd done that a year, I got promoted to 30 cents an hour. And besides that, I had my first great big success as a teacher. I wonder if Professor Lowitt can match this. The chairman of the history department called me in and said, look, you've been correcting papers here. You've been doing a good job. Yeah, you're a good student. Well, thank you. Now look, Montana has the first chance to get anywhere in the Rocky Mountain Football Conference this year. But our fullback, you know he's carrying the team. He has to get through 3 courses. And he's failing history. And I said, so? He said, well, I want you to tutor him in history. Don't give him the answers, but make sure he gets through the course. And now this fullback was a kid out of Chicago, out of the slums of Chicago, but he wasn't stupid. You know that old saying of James Server, he wasn't dumber than an ox, but he wasn't much smarter either. Well, that wasn't true of this boy. He was a smart enough kid, except they had him out there on the football field practicing all the time. Well, I tutored him. He got through the exams. And Montana finished well up in that conference for the first time, well, since anybody could ever remember. But that wasn't the successful story. That boy went back and became a fullback for the old Chicago Bears team and made more money than any history student I ever had. Well, these programs then, these relief programs, that sometimes people look back with scorn. When they served a purpose, they did an awful lot of good. One of the programs that was started out as a relief program was the Rural Electrification Administration. This was to put unemployed people to work, but after a few of them electrocuted themselves stringing wires around, they decided that they had to move to another kind of program and not just put unskilled workers out working there with electricity. We moved under the Rural Electrification Administration, set up as a relief agency in 35. We moved to statutory authority in 36 and encouraged communities to establish rural electric co-ops. They had a hard time at first, but the big success they have now, you wouldn't believe it, but back then they were bitterly opposed by the private power companies, and a lot of them faced a hard time because the private power companies put up what were called spite lines. They pick out the key area out there in the country and run a line right out through there and serve all of that, and then leave the scattered area for the rural co-op to pick up. It was hard, but rural electrification, as you know, has been very successful, and it's just not in controversy today. We hear a lot about that in the department too. A letter came in that we found in the files a few years ago, talking about a West Virginian writing about when they first got electricity in the house, and turning on the electric lights. Dad turned on the one in the kitchen first, and he just stood there, holding on to the pole chain. He said to me, "Carl, come here and hang on to this so I can turn on the light in the sitting room." I knew he didn't have to do that, and I told him to stop pulling it, that it would stay on. He finally let go and then looked kind of foolish. Well, a simple thing like that, you see, that people didn't have these amenities of life, but the Rural Electrification Administration brought them. In 1929, 9% of American farms had central station electric service. In 1939, just 4 years after REA was in effect, 22%. And most of that had happened in those 4 years. And by 1979, or today, 79%. One or two other programs, two other programs I'll mention. Farm Credit Administration was established in 1933 as an independent agency. It's been in and out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's a U.S. separate agency now. This was bringing together a group of credit programs that had started in 1916 with the establishment of the Federal Land Bank system with government capital. By 1947, the Farm Credit Administration and the Federal Land Banks and all of the other subsidiary organizations had become so successful that they paid all government money back. Now, the land banks were set up to make long-term loans, and in 1933, the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act made funds available at lower costs than ever before, with extensions of time and negotiations over terms of mortgages. This was covered into the Farm Credit Administration and was a real basis for it. I don't see today that the Farm Credit Administration is in any trouble. In fact, the Farm Credit Administration is a regular big banking institution now in many ways. It still provides a tremendous service for farmers, but primarily provides service for the commercial farmer. Just one other point. Food distribution. Gladys said that when we had the slaughter of the little pigs, and then later cattle were brought out there and bought out in the drought areas, that these goods, and some wheat was purchased, and these goods were turned over for relief distribution. Again, when I taught at Twin Views Public School, we had canned pork and gravy from these hogs that were slaughtered here in Iowa. It was good stuff, too. Well, that reminds me of another one, though, on the wheat distribution program. My mother was the county chairman of the WCTU, and I took the pledge at a very early age. Promised not to drink intoxicating beverages until I was 21 years of age or over. Now, this was during Prohibition, of course, but out in Lavina, Montana, nobody ever really heard of Prohibition. Nobody ever tried to enforce it. So the bar was wide open. But nevertheless, I stayed out of it. But then I got this contract to teach school. I was getting $60 each and every month. And I went up to sign the contract, and the chairman of the school board signed it, and I signed it, and he says, "Now," he said, "we're glad to have you." And I said, "I'm sure glad to have the job." He says, "Look, I'm going to give you a bottle of the best home brew you ever tasted." And I kind of hemmed and well, what should I do? I was about 17 or 18 years old at the time. I hadn't reached 21. Home brew, I signed the pledge. But $60 a month was $60 a month. It took me about 5 seconds to say, "Yes, sir, I sure would like to taste that home brew." He brought it out. I drank some of the home brew. And he said, "Isn't that the best home brew you ever tasted in your life?" I said, "It sure is." Right here, it's the first home brew. He said, "You know how I happened to make that?" He said, "The government came out here with wheat for my cattle. And they didn't know that half of them had died, and I'd have to ship the other half off because they were going to die if I didn't get them to feed. But he says, I took the wheat anyhow, and it makes the best home brew you ever tasted in your life." So in some of these government programs then, we have to remember that you can start out with the best of intentions, but they have to be administered. I think I want to emphasize that this local administration that we have had in the AAA has been a very great advantage. Then, of course, in 1933, the USDA and the Federal Emergency Relief Administration began a program of direct distribution of food. There was some monies from various programs. Also began cotton distribution programs, cotton mattress program. School lunch began in 1935 and expanded rapidly. Food stamp program began in Rochester, New York in 1939. It was dropped during World War II and then was more recently revived. Now, once in a while, some of us in agriculture and in farming say, "Why, look, we don't want that food stamp program attached to the Department of Agriculture. That's just a relief program." It is a relief program, and it's an important relief program. It's awfully important, though, to the Department of Agriculture. This food distribution program, that started back there in the 30s, began because that's where they had the food. Today, we hand out vouchers for food, and it doesn't make that much difference, except that where we're talking about increasing the target payment for corn, we got to talk to some congressmen from New York City and Chicago. And they say, "Well, what are you going to do for us?" And we say, "Well, look, have you thought about the food stamp program, what that's doing for your constituents? Would you like to go back and say, well, I got much more money for food stamps here in the city?" And then we say, yes, well, maybe we can work this out together. In other words, food stamps, food distribution is an important relief program in these United States, but it also has another importance for farmers. It's a trading point in relation to getting farm legislation through the Congress at a time when less than 4% of the American people are farmers. Thank you.
Our final speaker on this panel, discussing the poverty aspects of New Deal farm programs, Harry McDean from San Diego State University.
I might remind Wayne that out in Southern California, a few of the universities have found themselves in trouble recently for giving special classes for football players. So I'm glad that his team didn't turn out to be as successful as USC. What brought me to study farm poverty programs during the New Deal was a biography I began to write nearly a decade ago on M.L. Wilson, a graduate of Iowa State University, who went on to become Undersecretary of Agriculture and to direct a variety of other bureaus during the New Deal period. I noticed as I researched in the files, the history section, the Department of Agriculture and the National Archives, that many of the programs that the New Deal is so well known for, that Gladys and Wayne have talked about, were not nearly as important in the mind of M.L. Wilson as some thought it might have been. M.L. Wilson is well known for having been the designer and perhaps creator of the domestic allotment plan, and he, with the help of some attorneys, wrote the Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment Act, and he was responsible for many of the features in the Farm Security Administration's operations. As I researched many of these areas, I began to notice that they were not nearly as important in his mind as a lot of thoughts he had, a lot of plans he had in mind for this nation's poor farmers. And this, over the last decade, has led me into the private papers of a lot of the other New Deal's planners, as well as the oral histories and private collections of men like Henry Wallace. And what I've come away with is kind of a reinterpretation of what all the New Dealers were trying to do during the 1930s, and many of the types of policies they sought to pursue during the 1930s that are very different from what most observers of the New Deal have come away with. Most of you probably know that books such as that by Donald Grubbs, who's going to speak next, as well as some of the new ones like Paul Donenfeld's book on the Dust Bowl, or Donald Worster's book on the Dust Bowl, and made some very clear observations that New Deal programs, when you got right down to it, come right down to the heart of them, hurt poor farmers far and away more than they help them. And the accusation is, even in some of the literature, more bold than that. New Deal programs were, such as the ones that Gladys and Wayne have talked about, were designed solely with the purpose in mind of helping middle-class farmers, namely Iowa farmers, Illinois farmers, Indiana farmers, those who had good farms, big acreages, fine soil, and that these kinds of programs were designed to help them, and not at all to help those people who were poor. Well, what my research has led me to conclude is that between 1933 and 1940, the New Dealers, the planners in the Department of Agriculture, men such as M.L. Wilson, men such as Henry Wallace, men such as Rexford Tugwell, and Mordecai Ezekiel, developed three very clear and distinctly different policies toward poor farmers. Now, what some of you might think is a poor farmer today just would not have qualified in the 1930s. What they viewed to be a poor farmer was somebody on sub-marginal farmland. And this could be really one of two types. Somebody in the Great Plains, or somebody in the cutover region, or somebody in the Deep South who lived on property, on land that clearly should not be farmed, that ought to be turned back into its natural state, or might be converted into a marshland for waterfowl. Clearly it should not be farmed. And there was a second kind of person who qualified as a poor farmer. This was somebody who was clearly what they called undercapitalized, meaning his farm was far and away too small, or he could not afford the machinery he needed to expand the size of his farm to make it profitable. So these were two kinds of people who were called submarginal farmers. Now, these people were to be treated very differently than all other farmers. And the New Dealers developed three very different policies during the course of the 1930s to deal with them. The problem is, as Larry Remley said earlier at the National Partisan League, they won and they failed. They won in the sense that their policies were implemented. They became true administrative entities. But they failed in the sense that no matter how hard these men tried, those policies and the programs that resulted from them were never applied on an extensive scale. They were used throughout the 1930s in a small way, and instead of ever becoming applied on a grand way. Now, what were these three ones? Well, the first one was the kind of the product of a decade of observations made by M.L. Wilson, a man who's a graduate of Iowa State, and who went on to become Undersecretary of Agriculture during the latter part of the New Deal period. Initially, in the early part of the 1930s, M.O. Wilson directed the wheat section of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And he badly wanted out of this wheat section so he could administer what he thought was one of the most important policies that the New Deal could develop in agricultural life. This was a policy he had designed to help out the poor farmers, the submarginal farmers whom I have described. His observation was clean and simply this, that in the future there would be far and away fewer farmers than there were in 1933, 1934. His estimate was probably 2, perhaps as many as 3 million of the 6 million farmers there were in 1933 would have to get out of farming for a variety of reasons that I have described, owing to the character of submarginal farms. So what to do about them? What was the best thing to do with these farmers who would have to get out of farming? In his view, the hope for these types of farmers was to provide them with a new community life in the states in which they had lived, preferably in the states of, for example, of Montana or of North Dakota. A new community life that the federal government would sponsor and subsidize and create. Now, what would they do in these new communities the government would sponsor and create? It was his hope that in these communities they could work part-time in industries that would decentralize into these areas. Now, he had observed, and it was his firm belief by early 1933, that industries, the trend of modern industries was to move the city, move from the city, move the major industrial complexes that had become prominent in the 1920s and 1930s and move out into the countryside. And indeed, there were some that already had done this. Studebaker had done it, Ford had done it, B.F. Goodrich had done it, and studies indicated the trend of industries was to move into the countryside. So his notion then was to develop rural communities. The government would build them in areas adjacent to, that were right nearby to, major arteries of transportation, major sources useful to industry, natural resources useful to industry. And this would act as an incentive, a greater incentive than ever, for industries to decentralize. Now, with this idea in mind, as I say, the most prominent one of its day, 1933, 1934, among the New Deal policymakers, the Division of Subsistence Homesteads was created. It was an appendage, the Division of Subsistence Homesteads was an appendage to the National Recovery Act of 1933. The problem that Wilson found when he became its director, early in the summer of 1934, when he became director of the Division of Subsistence Homesteads, he immediately found he ran into all kinds of problems he had not anticipated. Probably the most important of these problems was the view the Congress had of the Division of Subsistence Homesteads. The Congress, which had funded the act, was very anxious to see these communities developed. So far so good. The Congress agreed fully with M.O. Wilson that it would be a good idea to develop subsistence communities or communities out in the agricultural states. But in the view of almost all congressmen, and this was based on a careful assessment the Department of Agriculture made of congressmen, so this is not something M.O. Wilson just sat there and dreamed up himself by his own, through his own observations in the Congress. But the Department of Agriculture told him that as far as the Congress was concerned, they viewed this administration as one to create subsistence homesteads for unemployed industrial workers. So as far as the Congress viewed this, they wanted the workers to go from cities out into these rural areas and live temporarily on relief on these subsistence homesteads. The chief argument against Wilson here, and that would be that he should have, merely in good dog-headed administrative style, paid no attention to what the Congress wanted, and to have developed projects strictly of the kind he wanted. But as probably Gladys and Wayne remember of M.O. Wilson, he was a democratic idealist in the sense that he probably, more than any other administrator, believed in giving other men's plans a trial. And the result was that the Division of Subsistence Homesteads developed a variety of different kinds of subsistence projects during his administration, instead of developing ones exclusively where he would have put them. In areas nearby to major arteries of transportation, in areas nearby natural resources that industries could use. He allowed a lot of them to develop that were the dreams of men like Ralph Borzoi. I don't know if any of you heard of him, who had a lot of influence among congressmen from New York. He wanted to found some kind of utopian dream villages where you would return to frontier style of life. These kinds of communities were developed. The result of that is, by 1934, that division was under heavy attack by organizations of farmers who thought that the American Farm Bureau Federation, to give you a classic example, came out against this whole division and everything that Wilson was doing in it, because they thought, quite correctly, given what the division was beginning to do, that this was going to create more farmers, and that this was a plot to dump a bunch of undesirables out into agricultural states, undesirables from the cities. So what happened in the Subsistence Homesteads Division, and it came under heavy attack for these reasons. It was therefore susceptible to abolishment, and nobody was more anxious to see this whole scheme abolished than Rexford Tugwell, who was also in the Department of Agriculture and at this time Undersecretary of Agriculture. He thought M.O. Wilson's plan to find industrial jobs for the poor farmers was a correct attack on farm poverty. This was the only hopeful one. He thought M.O. Wilson was totally correct in trying to find industrial jobs for those farmers who simply couldn't stand farming. However, he thought industries would never decentralize. It was his view then that farmers who were going to have to get out of farming, the poor farmers, would have to be moved near into cities. And the result of that is that he went directly to Roosevelt himself, directly to the President himself, and asked Roosevelt if he would abolish the Subsistence Homesteads Division and create another administration called the Resettlement Administration, and this was done. The Resettlement Administration was created in 1935, and its purpose was, its key purpose in the direction of Rexford Tugwell, was to create suburban satellite communities. Now, this is mine. What Tugwell did was to create a suburban resettlement division. He created some other divisions too, but the chief and most important one was the suburban resettlement division, and a second division called the land utilization division. The land utilization division's job was to go out and buy up the land of these poor farmers, these submarginal farmers. The suburban resettlement division's job to locate and build, construct under federal grants, suburban communities into which these poor farmers could be moved. Now, the difference here between Tugwell and Wilson was that Wilson was a farmer and Tugwell was not. Wilson always doubted farmers would be willing to leave rural areas, agricultural areas, and move into cities. Tugwell was a city man, born and raised, lived all his life in the cities. He did not. He thought poor farmers would be anxious to get out of the dull life of rural America and move into suburbs adjacent to, say, Baltimore, or Washington, D.C., where he built some of these suburbs, or another one he built right near Cincinnati, right outside of Cincinnati. His idea was these farmers would move into these. Now, the problem Tugwell had, almost instantly, was the cost of these suburbs. They were immensely costly. The homes that he constructed sold for between $15,000 and $16,000. And I've seen some of these homes and priced them today, especially ones in a place called Greenville, Maryland. The same homes that were going for $15,000, $16,000 are today priced at near $200,000. The same house. We all know about inflation, but I'm giving you comparative values. So the values of these homes was astronomical for that day. The result was congressmen and senators alike descended on him with an obvious appraisal of this program. The most clear cut was, how are these poor farmers, you're going to move into these suburbs, find jobs, A, and B, pay for these homes. And it was clear by 36, 37 that this was a very unlikely development. In fact, the criticism was so high, by late 1936, Tugwell was threw up his arms and said, I can't do the job, this is hopeless, and he resigned. So now you're in the last program, which I think I can get rid of in 1 minute. And this is that clearly, in the view of both M.O. Wilson and Rexford Tugwell, and increasingly now by 1936, the Secretary of State, Henry Wallace, increasingly these men came to conclude that until programs that would bring about industrial recovery became a reality, until there was industrial recovery in this economy, something very different would have to be done. And the result was that after Bankhead-Jones bill was passed, the Farm Security Administration was created. These men concluded that probably the a stopgap measure would be needed. Something would be needed until recovery occurred, and therefore they concluded that poor farmers should be moved on to giant, large-scale community farms organized and funded by the government. This way, these poor farmers would have some benefits that only big farmers had. First, they'd be able to use machines they otherwise would not be able to use, because the government would buy them, use them on a grand scale on these huge community farms. They could afford to have these machines. Second, because of consolidation, they'd be able to have more efficient division of labor among themselves. And they thought that this would allow them to compete effectively with what was going to be the commonplace development in all of American agriculture, consolidation and mechanization. They knew this was a surety, just as you farmers sitting here today know this is a surety. If you're fighting against it, you're wasting your time. Consolidation and mechanization, two things that were certainty. So these men said, these things are certainties. The only way we can help out these poor farmers until there's industrial recovery is to organize these community farms. And they did it, and that lasted until about 1940, when, of course, industrial recovery began to occur. In 1941, 1942, these programs all were investigated by the United States Senate, and because of the accusation, especially that these community farms were communistic, inspired by communists, and then Beanie Baldwin are called before the Senate, were all communists, Claude Worker, all these community programs were abolished in 1942, 1943. So what I'm saying is this: it is indeed true that all of these programs were a failure because they affected no more than 1% of this nation's poor, less than 1% of this nation's poor farmers. So Donald Groves is correct. These programs did not help out the poor farmers, but these policymakers were not blind to the problems of poor farmers. They were aware of it. They did develop policies for them. The result is, however, they failed for the reasons that I give you. Probably the most obvious reason they failed is because they knew little about corporate finance, nothing about banking, they knew nothing about the process of industrial funding, the stock market, and therefore they had no idea about how to develop programs to encourage industries to recover. Without industrial recovery, their programs that would have failed. Thank you.
It took us just 1 minute short of an hour for the program. We will run over a bit, but I would be delighted to run over in terms of listening to your comments or having members of our panel respond to your questions. Would you please identify yourself as you present your comment or question, and identify also the person you wish to respond to your remarks. Sir?
Okay, my name is Bob Talkmeyer, and I live in Illinois. And I'm just a little bit hot under the collar right now, so you're going to have to give me a minute to slow down. But the first thing is, the industrial recovery that he talked about in 1945 cost 50 million lives. And that's the thing that put it back on its feet. It wasn't somebody sitting at their desk thinking their way through it. And I also take the feeling that actually